So you don't believe in God.
What you have to realize is that science today operates under what we call methodological naturalism.
Evolution does not work, no matter how old the universe. Well, good morning. I'd like to thank everyone for being here today. Appreciate you getting up early and coming out. Topic of my presentation is going to be, is there enough time for evolution? And I decided I'd go ahead and answer that on the first slide. And the answer is evolution does not work, no matter how old the universe. And so that's one. Every now and then you'll run into people who say, well, you Christians just want the universe to be young, so there's not enough time for evolution. It's kind of a loaded question because, again, it does not matter how old the universe is, evolution does not work. And Joe will be talking more about that and some of the other speakers today, and I'll have a little bit of that in my presentation. And so the question is, then why do evolutionists and atheists want to make the universe extremely old? And I only had room for 3 bullets. I'm sure many in the audience could think of several others, but 3 that really stand out to me is, one, an old universe. Well, that contradicts the Bible. And so if you have someone that's really dedicated to leading people away from Christianity or trying to disprove the Bible, age is a really, I'll just say they consider that a really good topic to attack on, because as we'll talk about, it's really just dependent on assumptions and very limited data. Obviously, we can't go back in time and see exactly what happened. It's not true science in the sense of being observable, testable, and repeatable. And so I like to attack on age. You don't see evolutionists, atheists talking about free will, because they hate that, because they realize that for us to have any choice whatsoever, for you to have been able to choose to come here this morning, or even choose which shoe to put on first, you had to be more than just a combination of several trillion atoms. In other words, if you were just several trillion atoms, you'd just be a chemical reaction. You would have zero control over what you were doing, any more than a log in a bonfire would have control over where it was going to burn. And so they don't like to talk about free will. They don't like to talk about the origin of life, because, again, when one thinks about it, well, if life could just randomly make itself, why can't we make it? I mean, we've got all these bacteria we could reverse engineer. We have all of these things that we could do to make life. We cannot do it. Hundreds of billions of dollars, smartest PhDs, best labs. We can't make life, but the atheists, the evolutionists, they want us to pretend that it just made itself. And so it's, again, it's just strange. So they don't like those topics, but they will tend to talk about age. And so that's one of the reasons we're going to focus on that during this presentation. The other line of reasoning, or the second one, is that when they insert billions of years, that adds a certain amount of mystique. And anybody here ever watch a Star Wars movie? Okay, I'm just seeing if you're awake, because usually I give about every single hand. But the reason that movie, to me at least, starts out with a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, is it lets people realize, okay, this means I need to just kind of turn my brain off and check out and just enjoy the movie. Enjoy the special effects and however you want to enjoy it, because it just adds this mystique. It's like what they're really saying is there's just going to be a lot of imagination in this, and don't think about too hard about a lot of the physics or quote unquote physics that they're going to be trying to present. And so if they can insert billions of years, now all of a sudden, well, life just made itself. Well, if you think of that today, it's like, well, that's absurd. But if they say, boy, 3.7, 3.8 billion years ago, life made itself, well, they're hoping the person will fixate on the 3.7, 3.8 billion years ago and think, well, wow, yeah, that's a long, long time ago. But as Jeff pointed out last night, the laws of physics were the same. And so life couldn't have made itself that long ago any more than it could make itself now. But that's another reason to try to make the universe very old. And the other one, and I think giving people the benefit of the doubt, I think a lot of people, they just think the universe is very old, the Earth's very old, because that's what they've been told. And unfortunately, they're being told at younger and younger ages. I think you could probably ask a astute 5-year-old how old the universe is, and he would at the very least could say billions of years, or he might 13.7 billion years, but I think they just updated to 13.8 billion years. It depends on how much they follow this. And so, well, boy, if you've thought something was fact from your earliest memories, it is really hard to turn that around. And so I think a lot of times when we're talking to people, we really have to get them to just rethink, okay, so they believe this. Well, why do you believe this? And of course, that's true really across the entire spectrum of trying to lead a person from wherever they're at to where they will actually obey the gospel, until they will put their faith in God, until they will actually believe the Bible. Now, when we talk about evolution not working no matter how old the universe, the other thing that people will run into is if they go out on the internet, you'll get some very theoretical arguments, and people will say, well, maybe this happened. And so one of the ways to talk to someone is say, well, we all get to choose where we put our faith. I think Joshua 24:15 is a good verse for that. We all get to choose where we put our faith. So where is it reasonable to, where does it make the most sense to put our faith? But what they'll run across are quotes like this. This was Thomas Huxley. It's one of the older quotes. There's probably people before him, but it's 1860. So this is right when Darwinism, Darwin's publishing, and it's kind of starting to take root. He proposed that given 6 monkeys, 6 typewriters, and unlimited time, the monkeys would eventually type all of the books in the British Library. Well, the key to that statement was the unlimited time. And so he's basically using a mathematical property of infinity, and infinity times any positive number equals infinity. And that's just, it's just how we define infinity. So you could take infinity times, say 1 in 1 followed by 100 billion zeros. So again, I didn't say 1 in 100 billion, I said 1 in 1 followed by 100 billion zeros. Some just absurdly small number, and you multiply it by infinity, it still equals infinity. And that's just how we define it. So he was playing that mathematical probability. Now the question would come back, would it make sense for us to put our faith in something that had a probability of 1 in 1 followed by 100 billion zeros? Versus putting our faith in something a little more realistic? Well, of course it wouldn't, but that's never mentioned. So that's kind of I won't necessarily call it a sleight of hand, but it's when people are out, surfing the net, they'll run across arguments like this. And so I thought it'd be kind of fun. We'll just apply Huxley's argument to the real world. And notice a lot of small children here. I think that's really important. We need to be telling our children or instructing them in this subject really as young of age as possible. So if you have young children, sometimes you go out to the toy store and you can buy these little typewriters. At least you could when my kids were young, and they'd have 26 letters, and that was it. Nothing fancy, but obviously you're just trying to get the child to learn letters. And sometimes the real fancy ones, because my kids are pretty old now, would be like you press the A and it actually say A. So wow, high tech. And so but the point was, so you'd have 26 letters on this typewriter. Well, say you put Huxley's, say you put his monkeys in front of these typewriters. Well, if it was totally random, well, what would be the odds of them typing a W? Well, they got 26 choices, and they're just kind of randomly. Or some people like saying, if a cat walks in the room, which letters are going to step on her? However you want to just think totally random. Well, it's going to have a 1 in 26 chance of hitting a W. Okay, that's fine. So then, what are the odds of hitting a W and then hitting an E? Well, the odds of a W were 1 in 26, and then the odds of them hitting any other letter the second time, well, that's also going to be 1 in 26. So the odds of hitting a W followed by an E, well, that's 1 in 26 times 1 in 26. That's 1 in 676. Well, that could still happen. Boy, if they want to type "we are," that's getting harder. Now all of a sudden, "we are," you're 1 in 11,881,376. So now, boy, if your cat walks into a room and routinely types "we are," you don't want to follow him around a little bit, see what he's up to. Now, we are a bunch of monkeys. That's 1 in basically 2 followed by 28 zeros. So that's getting really, really, really rare. And if they type something like, "we are a bunch of monkeys trying to type something that makes sense, it's not working yet, but maybe given infinite time," now you're down at 1 in 6.89 times 10 to the 135th. And in other words, 1 in 1 followed by over basically 135 zeros. And so it's just not going to happen. Well, there are more sophisticated books in the British Library than that last string of letters. And so even though Huxley can make what sounded like a very eloquent mathematical argument, in the real world it makes no sense. And that's what we run into when people start talking about things like the Big Bang or like this method or that matter. They can claim mathematically or theoretically any this could have possibly happened, but when you follow it to its logical end, it makes no sense whatsoever. And just wanted to know, just these numbers are numbers beyond what any of us can imagine. 20 billion years, that's 6.3 times 10 to the 23rd millionths of a second. So again, you're talking about that simple string of letters at the end, 1 in basically 7 followed by 135 zeros. 20 billion years, you divide it into millionths of a second, that's tiny compared to that number. I mean completely, really non-existent compared to 10 to the 135th. And the point for that is I was talking with someone once, And you get into the details, they say, well, no one really understands how long 20 billion years is. And you say, well, no, it's 6.3 times 10 to the 23rd microseconds. I mean, it's not, you can quantify those things, but it's just, again, it goes back to this illusion that somehow long periods of time, or what they consider long periods of time, makes even the impossible somehow possible. And then there's agreement that the number of atoms in the universe is less than 1 followed by 80 zeros. And again, that's a very small number compared to that 7 times 10 to the 135th. So just, I think it's important to try to just think through this area, because again, it really comes down to where we choose to put our faith. And another reason it's important is it's relatively easy to get someone to doubt evolution because it goes against everything we know about science. Now that said, the majority of people still believe evolution. But when we really go point by point, evolution on every point is refuted by what we know about science. Now, it's obviously not spun that way, but it should be, logically, if the person's thinking logically, easy to convince them that evolution doesn't work. But does that do them any good for eternity? No, it doesn't do them any good at all. And so you'll have people that will reject evolution, but then again, they don't choose to put their faith in the Bible, they don't choose to obey the gospel. And a classic example of that was Sir Frederick Hoyle. He actually coined the term Big Bang. He's a famous British astronomer. But he said the likelihood of the formation of life from inanimate matter is 1 to a number with 40,000 noughts after it. It's enough to bury Darwin and the whole theory of evolution. There was no primeval soup, neither on this planet nor on any other. And if the beginnings of life were not random, they must therefore have been the product of purposeful intelligence. And so he comes to that conclusion. Well, if you or I are talking with him and he says that, like, wow, this is great. We'll have a Bible study this afternoon, and then we'll have him baptized tonight. It's because boy, he's just totally rejected evolution at that point. But the problem is he did reject evolution, but he did not want to put his faith in God. And so what he ended up doing was, with some other famous scientists, coining this idea of what he called directed panspermia. And this is another thing we have to watch out for in this area is the big words. Because directed panspermia, coming from a famous astronomer that actually named the Big Bang, well, that has to be right. Big word, fancy term. Well, all directed panspermia means is life could not have evolved on Earth, and that person doesn't want to believe in God, so aliens must have put us here. And so if he had just said, hey, I think aliens put life on Earth, boy, he wouldn't have gotten near the press. But he wrote 3 books talking about this idea that aliens put life on Earth. And he's a really smart guy. And so the question is obvious, well, who made the aliens? Okay, well, did you have some smarter aliens that made the aliens put the life on Earth? It's like, okay, fine, then who made the smarter aliens? Well, he had the really smart aliens that made the smarter aliens. And so he never answered the question. But he was able possibly to distract himself or to pretend he had answered the question, to the point that, as far as anyone knows, he died without putting his faith in God. And so you'll also, it's important to keep that in mind also, that even though this particular topic is very important for our young people, because this is how they're going to get, people are going to try to lead them astray. But really, for any of us, realize when we're in these kinds of discussions, the goal isn't just to get them to reject atheism, to reject evolution. The goal is also eventually to get them to obey the gospel. I think age, it could be analogous to a gateway drug. And the reason I say that is if we read the Bible, and Justin did an excellent job last night, straightforward reading of the Bible, obviously the earth is a few thousand years old. Well, if a person can be convinced to distrust the Bible in that area, and so there's 2 things that can be done. They can either be convinced that they need to distort the Bible, pretend words mean things or say things that the words don't actually mean or say, and just kind of twist Scripture to somehow try to accommodate the Big Bang within the Bible. Even just distorting the Bible, if you look at the distortions that are required to enable an extremely long age, those distortions are actually smaller than the distortions that are needed to make the Bible really say anything we want it to. In other words, we could pretty much make if we're allowed to use that level of distortion, I could go through the Bible and whatever belief I had, I could say somehow that the Bible justified that with that level of distortion. Or you could also say just distrust the Bible. And either way, now all of a sudden that person has gone from knowing that the Bible is God's inerrant word to, well, I either I need to get with a guy that's got 8 PhDs to interpret the Bible for me, or or just as bad. I can't really trust the Bible. I'll look at it when I agree with it. I'll agree with it, but when I don't, I won't. And so if an atheist or an evolutionist convinces a person to get to that point, well, in their mind, they've done a lot as far as leading them astray. And so that's again why age tends to be the focus of most atheists, especially when they're debating or they're in a public forum. So I want to start out. This is Genesis 11, 10 through 26. If you go back and read the genealogies and you look at it, it's really a tight genealogy. And so using that particular genealogy, a lot of people estimate, well, the flood occurred maybe around 2350 BC. And then there's some range in the dates that people will assign to that, but it's about a date for when the flood occurred. Well, the counter to that, when you're talking to someone that has bought into old ages, they'll say, but wait, there's artifacts from near the time of the flood that have carbon-14 to carbon ratios that are only a few % of those seen today. Okay, now most people, if someone said that to you in the elevator, you just kind of glaze over and hope you're getting to your floor fairly quickly, because it's not that seems very abstract. But what they're really getting at is what they're saying is there's no way the flood could have been that recent. Couldn't have been 2, 3, even 4,000 years, 4 or 5, even more thousand years ago, because of that particular ratio. And the reason is if you apply secular or atheistic assumptions to those ratios, then you get biblically inconsistent dates. And we'll run through a couple of examples. But the point that they don't mention is if I apply biblically consistent assumptions to those dates, then I get to those ratios, that carbon-14 to carbon ratio, then I do get biblically consistent dates. And so it's all down on the assumptions, because all that's actually measured is this ratio of carbon-14 to carbon. That's all you can measure. Beyond that, it's all assumptions. It's how do I interpret that ratio to somehow back out what I think that implies for the age of that particular artifact. If it's a wooden bowl or whatever particular object it might be. Now, very briefly, the way carbon dating works is there's a certain amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere, and that's primarily caused by cosmic rays interacting with the atmosphere. And right now, with that generation rate, there's about 1 carbon-14 atom for every trillion carbon atoms. And so, for example, if I was to analyze the wood in this podium, about 1 out of a trillion of those atoms would be a carbon-14. And so that's what the current ratio of carbon-14 to carbon is. And so, plants, trees, they get carbon from the carbon dioxide in the air, and they take that in. And so the carbon that's in, for example, the plants and the trees, well, that's going to have that same ratio. It's going to be 1 carbon-14 for every trillion carbon atoms. And so this podium seems pretty recent. It's probably fabricated from wood that's relatively young. I don't know, a few years. And so that ratio, if I were to take this wood and sample it, it would be 1 in a trillion. Now, the half-life of carbon-14 is 5,730 years. So if we were to come back 5,730 years from now, and this podium was still here, well, I could take a sample of that wood, and now all of a sudden, the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon would be half of what it is today. So it'd be about 1 carbon-14 for every 2 trillion carbon atoms. Come back another 5,730 years later, so it's been a total of 11,460 years. Well, now I'm half again. So now I would be 1 carbon-14 for every 4 trillion carbon atoms. And so that's basically how carbon dating works. But again, the actual measurement is that ratio, and the date that's obtained from that is extremely dependent on the assumptions. And so if I'm an atheist or an evolutionist, well, of course, I've already assumed that the Earth is billions of years old. And so from that assumption, well, this carbon-14, and I assume it's uniformitarianism. So you assume that everything's been about the same for all of those billions of years. From that assumption, then I would say that, well, the production rate is equal to the decay rate and everything's the same. So in general, and they're allowed to make assumptions, or they're allowed to calibrate things. It's kind of interesting. If a creationist calibrates things, that's disallowed. But the evolutionists, they say, well, we can tweak this or that a little bit. But they would say that roughly that carbon-14 to carbon ratio has always been about like it is today. 1 carbon-14 per trillion carbon. And of course, they don't believe in a global flood. They absolutely reject the idea of a global flood. Now, if I make biblically consistent assumptions, well, first of all, I know the Earth's a few thousand years old. too young for carbon-14 to have reached approximate equilibrium. And so in other words, the production rate may not equal the decay rate, because if the Earth's 6,000 years old and the half-life of carbon-14 is 5730, well, you haven't reached secular equilibrium yet. And there's equations you can demonstrate this to people if they really get interested in it. We also know as Christians that the global flood occurred. Well, during the flood, there was a tremendous amount of carbon removed from the environment. A lot of the coal, oil, natural gas that we see buried was very likely buried during the flood. Well, that removal of carbon from the environment would have a tremendous effect on this carbon-14 to carbon ratio. And also the ratio that we measure today is also strongly affected by the ratio and the distribution in the original creation. I mean, we don't know what the carbon-14 content was in the original creation. That's not one of those details that some of us would love to know, but it's certainly nowhere in the Bible. So we don't know what that ratio could have been. Other factors, so the flood does appear to have been the last non-uniformitarian event affecting carbon-14 to carbon ratio. Now, the reason that's important is because that was the last major event. Well, carbon dating should work fairly well until you get back to within a few hundred years of the flood. And so say someone cut down a tree in 1600 and they made a wooden bowl out of it. Well, it actually doesn't matter too much which assumptions I make. I can make the biblically consistent assumptions, or I can make the atheistic assumptions. I'm going to get roughly the same date when I'm carbon dating that bowl, because the ratio, I just picked that number, but the ratio in 1600 AD was roughly the same as it was today. But when I start dating objects that were created very shortly after the flood, from wood that grew at that time, now all of a sudden that ratio could have been dramatically different. And so the reason I mention that is a lot of times people they'll start defending carbon dating, and they'll say, oh yeah, but we know this, we have this record that this piece of wood was fabricated at this date. And boy, it agrees very closely with carbon dating. Well, you'd expect that, unless you're dating something that, again, was from near the time of the flood. And so that's just another factor that could be important to mention to someone. But again, it's very important, because just because I can date something with carbon dating that's maybe 500 years old, 1,000 years old, doesn't really affect the overall assumptions they make when they start trying to use carbon dating to discredit the Bible, in terms of the genealogies or what was going on near the time of the flood. Sometimes people also say, well, can archaeology be used to calibrate carbon dating? And what's interesting is actually the opposite is true. And so in other words, carbon dating, they try to use that to calibrate archaeology. Well, you can imagine if the carbon dates are wrong, then whatever dates are obtained by using that calibration, they're going to be wrong also. And so I'll give an example. Say this pin, say I send this pin off to a lab and it gets measured, and they say, well, that pin is 200 feet long. Okay, so the pin's 200 feet long. And so now I want to say, well, how big is the podium here? And so I measure the podium, I go 1, 2, 3, 4. I say, wow, okay, that podium, just this top part, based on my calibrated source of measurement, this podium's 800 feet across. Okay, and so then someone else comes in later, and you tell them, well, that podium's 800 feet across. And maybe they have another podium, and they say, well, our podium's 900 feet across. And so, but the whole point is neither podium is 800 or 900 feet across. It's just they obtained that width because they used a wrong calibration. And so when we go to archaeology, again, past a certain point, the only way to calibrate ultimately is with carbon dating. Now, people will try to do things like tree rings. Tree rings are probably even more affected by the flood than carbon dating. In other words, just the climate after the flood. You can there's still trees existent now where you get well over one ring per season, and you can get, I think now there's some trees typically you can get 3 or 4 rings per season or more. And so you can't really use tree ring dating, or if you do, again, it's going to be highly dependent on the assumptions. And so when you look at how they try to calibrate, it really typically comes back to carbon dating. And so when we look at, well, this pottery style was prevalent at this time, or I found it in a certain layer, or has a certain amount of patina on it, it really depends on how did they calibrate that. And for the ages that, again, would contradict the Bible, their calibration is wrong. Now, again, younger ages, the further we get from the flood, the less difference this makes. And so it's certainly not saying if something was 1,000 years ago, actually those other methods are probably pretty good. That's because their ultimate calibration was also reasonable. And every now and then the other one people point out is, well, we have written records. Well, if you have a secular record from very long ago and it disagrees with the biblical record, well, which should we believe? And that's again going to be where a person chooses to put their faith. But time and time again, it's been shown that the Bible is accurate and that we should believe the written record as it was given in the Bible. Okay, so you're probably not used to seeing exponential equations at 9-ish in the morning on a Saturday. So we won't spend a lot of time on this, but do want to point out that this is something that's very quantitative. And so the way the equation that is written to determine how old something is the current concentration is equal to, and this is at the bottom of the screen, current concentration is equal to the initial concentration times e to the negative lambda t. In this case, lambda is just 0.6931 divided by the half-life, and t is time. And you keep all the units consistent, and that's how you estimate how old something is, I guess mathematically you'd say. But the point is the assumption comes into what was the initial concentration. And so, again, using that same assumption, I want to give an example where suppose that I had a wooden bowl or something made out of wood, and I measured its carbon 14 to carbon ratio, and it's like 2% of what it is today. And so, it's a 2%. Well, if I go through and I apply the atheistic assumptions to that, in other words, I assume that the carbon 14 to carbon ratio has always been the same. The Earth is so old, we're so uniform, always been the same. Well, I'll get a date at 32,330 years for that wooden bowl. Okay, now that's, no matter what, that's completely biblically inconsistent. It completely goes against the genealogies in the book of Genesis. And so, but the key is that I had to apply the atheistic assumptions. Now, if I use reasonable assumptions, in other words, what could reasonably have been affected for the effects of just the flood. So again, there's a lot of factors that can go into this, but if I just look into reasonable effects of the flood, I can take that exact same data, and that's all I have again, is that ratio is 2%, the carbon 14 to carbon ratio that I see today. Use that exact same data and I get a time of 4,210 years. And so in other words, that bowl was made 4,210 years ago. Well, all of a sudden, boy, that's biblically consistent. That would be very consistent with a bowl that was made by one of the the civilizations that popped up after the Tower of Babel, again, back close to the time of the flood. And so same data, but totally different conclusions from that data just based on whether I'm making atheistic assumptions or, again, I'm assuming that the Bible is correct. Some other discussion points you could have, how can there be carbon 14 in coal and diamonds, supposedly millions of years old? And so when you think about that, if every 5,730 years, half of the carbon 14 goes away, well, how could there be any left in something that's millions of years old? It's kind of the opposite. You've heard that riddle. If I was to say, I'm going to give you a penny today, 2 pennies tomorrow, 4 pennies the next day, 8 pennies the next day, and I'll do that for 2 months, or I'll give you $100 right now, which would you take? Yeah, if you trust me, you take the pennies. So I'm glad a lot of you guys took the pennies. You should just take the $100 and leave. But anyway, but with the, but if you do the pennies and you do that for 2 months, you end up with basically all the wealth in the world. And so, but it goes the opposite direction also. And so there is no way there should be any carbon 14 in coal and diamonds. And so evolutionists used to say, well, it must be contamination. Well, we are very good at making sure sources don't get contaminated now. They used to say, well, it's the inaccuracy of the measurement. And so now with the accelerator mass spectrometers, that's no longer a possibility either. It's not the inaccuracy in the measurements. It was interesting. I had, again, people that are friendly to the Bible, but they'll say things like, well, but isn't carbon dating accurate to within 100 years now? And what they're basing that on is the development of the accelerator mass spectrometry. Very, very accurate measurement. We can really measure the carbon 14 to carbon ratio extremely accurately. But again, that has nothing to do with the dates that are being inferred. The dates are due to the assumptions. But when they say that, what they're also pointing out is there's no way that this carbon 14 in diamonds and coal is just an anomaly. It's just a measurement error. It's just something to do with contamination. And so what you really have is that alone shows there's something extremely wrong with our carbon-14 dating, or with the assumptions that go into that. Again, we don't know how much carbon-14 was in the original creation, how it was distributed. What if radioactive decay rates were accelerated during creation week or the flood? That would have a tremendous effect not only on carbon dating, but also really any of the radiometric dating methods. I mentioned that carbon-14 is formed by cosmic rays interacting in the atmosphere. Well, what if that flux or spectrum is different in the past? And we know it changes. It varies depending on solar activity, strength of the sun's magnetic field, the strength of the Earth's magnetic field. A lot of things affect the cosmic ray, basically the number of cosmic rays and the energy of the cosmic rays that are entering the Earth's atmosphere. Carbon dioxide concentrations are different in the past, and that's again something that we talked about, just one of the other major assumptions. That was one of the areas that we know changed during the flood. And so again, but all those assumptions really play into the dates that assumed from the carbon dating. Now, you go out on the atheist websites, and it's don't recommend going out there, but if you do, they'll have these very technical sounding but superficial arguments. And I think they're very analogous to Fred Hoyle's argument about, well, life got here on Earth because aliens put us here. Now, of course, the way he phrased it, he took several pages to do it, made it sound very technical. And so people would just read it, and if they're disinterested, they would say, oh, okay, now I know how life got here. Aliens put us here. Because they're, and so you go to these websites, they try to sound technical, but they're just, it's nonsense what they write out there. And so one of my favorite ones, it says, well, radioactive decay of the uranium-thorium isotope series that is naturally found in rocks, that's why we see carbon-14 in coal and diamonds. Well, it has absolutely no way that can work. Not only just getting the carbon-14 into the diamond through the diamond lattice structure without having things be very obvious what had happened. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons that doesn't work. But even just looking at it from the standpoint of, well, what if we look at just how much decay would that take? Because again, when you can quantify something, it makes it a lot easier to decide which side of the argument is correct. And so if they were just to get the amounts, not even the distribution, somehow carbon-14 formed by this, you would need a uranium atom for every 2 carbon atoms in coal. So in other words, you'd have to have, at current decay rates, you'd have to have 1 uranium atom for every 2 carbon atoms. Well, that's not a coal mine, that's a fantastic uranium mine. I mean, obviously beyond any, actually, you can't get there. And so that's, based on measured values, of the uranium concentration. But what's interesting is you could turn that one around and say, well, that's at the current decay rates. But say that uranium decay rate was accelerated by factors of 1 billion. Well, then all of a sudden, in a relatively short period of time, maybe I could produce some carbon-14. But of course, they hate that. Because now all of a sudden you're saying that there's accelerated radioactive decay. So they've kind of painted themselves in a corner. They'll say, well, maybe this is how it happened. And you say, okay, lots of reasons that couldn't happen. But just to get the sheer amount, you'd need to accelerate that decay rate by a very large amount. And so again, it's interesting to hopefully, I shouldn't say hopefully, every now and then you'll run into someone that wants to get into this much detail, which is why we're getting into this much detail. But one thing is also want people to just be very comfortable talking about these subjects, talk through it to the level that you're comfortable. And then there's some excellent books out on the table, excellent books available if someone really wants more detail. And I mention that also because I don't want anybody walking out of here saying, well, I know there's a lot of assumptions in, carbon, 14 dating, and that's why, it's not biblically inconsistent, but then being afraid to mention that to somebody. And so I want everybody to be comfortable and talk about this to the point where you can at least mention it to somebody, but if they get into a lot of detail, don't be afraid to refer them to other resources. The reason I mention that is I think one of the tools atheists and evolutionists try to use is whenever we talk on a semi-technical topic, they try to say, well, you don't have a PhD in blah, 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 so you shouldn't be allowed to talk on it. Well, the truth's the truth. 2 + 2 = 4, whether a 5-year-old tells us that or a 75-year-old tells us that. And so again, don't want anybody to feel intimidated because it is a very straightforward discussion. But when someone starts getting into the math and everything else, if you're not comfortable, there's lots of good resources to feel free to refer them to. Another interesting point related to the accelerated radioactive decay is the helium retention in zircons. Now, it sounds very technical, but this was published, Don DeYoung and others had formed a a team of scientists, and they looked into this issue related to some of the age, and this is for more of the older ages. And with the zircon, what you have is it's basically uranium decaying into lead is what they're trying to use as the dating method. And when uranium decays into lead, when U-238 goes to a lead-206, you form 8 helium atoms. Okay, so now what's great about this is I have 2 ways I can measure or I can at least get an idea of where that zircon came from or how old that zircon is. One is I can look at the amount of uranium that's turned into lead, because the assumption is when that zircon formed, it's almost pure uranium, at least the uranium portion of it is. And so I can look at that, and if I assume the uranium is decaying at the same rate it is decaying today, I get an answer. And typically that answer can be in the billions of years. But the other thing I can look at is how many of those 8 helium atoms that occurred every time a uranium turned into a lead, how many of those are still in the zircon? And what I like about that measurement is that's actually something I can measure today. In other words, I can take a zircon into the lab and I can measure the helium diffusion rate out of that zircon, and I can say, okay, how long will that helium stay in there? It's very analogous, especially I think some of the new balloons are fancier, but when I was growing up, you get a balloon and you have it filled up, the little clown at the grocery store filled up with helium, and you take it home, and it was great. The thing just floated all over the place, you play with it. What happened after a couple, 3 days? Couldn't do that anymore. It's sitting on the floor. You can kick it around a little bit, but that's kind of boring. So the point was the helium was actually diffusing through the membrane in the balloon. I used to think it'd leak out through the end, so I'd put like 14 knots in the end of the balloon, trying to keep all the helium in. But that's not why the helium was leaking. The helium was coming out of the balloon because it's actually diffusing through the membrane. Well, so you could measure that diffusion rate. Well, in the same way, we can measure the rate that helium would leak out of zircons. And so what Dr. DeYoung and others did was they went ahead, and what's great is they published their model before they got the results back from the lab. And they basically said, well, if most of that radioactive decay occurred during creation week or the flood, how much helium would be left in the zircon? And if that, based on measured, the diffusion rates, and if it occurred over billions of years, how much helium would be left? And so if you look at that chart, that top curve and the dark circles, that's the actual data. And then the open circles are the actual data. The dark circles are what their model would have predicted. And so the creation model, saying that decay had to have happened within the past several thousand years, it hits the data dead on. And they published this before they had the data back. The uniformitarian model, saying that this must have happened over billions of years, it's off by about a factor of 100,000. So if this were a scientific argument, that would have sealed it right there. We would have said, okay, wow, we've got accelerated radioactive decay now and science would have actually moved forward. It would have been all of a sudden, well, now how did that happen? Why did that happen? What are some some factors that might come into play today? Well, it's not a scientific argument, and that's why I like to make the point that evolution, it's religion, it's not science, because obviously this would have had huge implications, and so it's just kind of ignored. No one really. Oh, that's neat. And so it's. But again, it's not. It's because it is not a scientific argument, because this is, again, this and data like it is very, relevant to this particular debate, just from a purely scientific standpoint. And then you'll get the one-dimensional questions coming back. And these, again, just field them. If you're not comfortable fielding them, refer them to some of the resources that are available. This is one that a lot of people say, well, if radioactive decay rates were greatly accelerated, wouldn't the resulting energy melt the Earth? And so, of course, what they're doing, what I mean by a one-dimensional argument, is they're assuming the only thing that changed was that radioactive decay rate. Well, if the radioactive decay rates change, the amount of energy released per decay is also going to change. And so the fact that we know from data that the decay rates were accelerated and the Earth didn't melt, well, that's a huge clue as to, okay, how exactly did those decay rates change? But instead, this is often tossed out as, and then the atheist sites will have this also. They'll say, well, we know it couldn't have been accelerated because you put so much energy into the Earth. But that's a one-dimensional. They're not taking into account. The real scientific thing would be to say, okay, if I was going to pursue this path, those decay rates accelerated, the Earth didn't melt, so how can you accelerate the decay rates? What would be some of the mechanisms? But again, that's not something that you're basically not allowed to pursue. Stretching of space. The Bible mentions God stretching out the heavens as a tent. The stretching of space in the Bible, some people say 17 times. well, what does the stretching of space, and this isn't just matter expanding into existing space, this is actually stretching space. What would that do to decay rates? Well, we have absolutely no idea. And so, but that's what makes it fun, so we can investigate it. And again, God has given us a lot of statements, a lot of clues that happened, but we're not, it's not something that a person's allowed to pursue, I guess you'd say, in mainstream science. Now, there are examples of decay rates being accelerated. This was in the CERN Courier, and you can go out, and these are, again, very highly respected technical journals. It talks about how they were able to just use ultrasonic cavitation. So that's not a really extreme environment. I mean, it is extreme from our standpoint, but not as far as what you'd expect to accelerate radioactivity. So they published that they were able to increase decay rates by a factor of 10,000, just with ultrasonic cavitation. So one method, this was a quote out of Popular Science, and it was actually published in, I think, 3 separate journals also. And they were talking basically about how Stanford and Purdue, and so it's Stanford and Purdue, 2 very well-recognized secular universities, pointing out that they're seeing fluctuations in the decay rates of their medical isotopes. And so for them to say that, because that is huge implications. And so, the articles are just saying, well, it's small, but it's statistically significant. We need to figure out what's happening here. And again, the tremendous pressure to try to find an alternate explanation, but it's still to the point where they're willing to publish it. To me, it's analogous to the soft tissue in dinosaur bones. People hated that. Evolutionists hated that when that came out. And so the response wasn't, wow, this is exciting, this is fantastic. It was, wow, how do we explain this away and still hold on to evolution? Well, you have the same thing here with the decay rates. What's interesting is all of the articles, they end with, well, yes, we think the decay rates are fluctuating, but the good news is it's only a small amount and it doesn't affect our radiometric dating methods. Well, so it's interesting, one, they do realize the implications, but also, well, if they're fluctuating today when things are physically pretty stable, I mean, when you think about it compared to creation week or the flood, things are physically very stable today. They're fluctuating even a little bit today. Well, what could have been happening during creation week or the flood? And again, it's something we don't know, but as Christians, it helps us realize it's not something that we should feel threatened about either. It's certainly not something that we should feel like, well, we have to somehow incorporate this into the Bible or accommodate it with the Bible. Last one I'll talk about, because I know we just have a few more minutes, is the what you'd call discordances in the dating methods. And so this is an example. A lot of rocks, most rocks you can't find any way to even try to radiometrically date them. And the ones that you can, typically there might only be one method that's usable. Well, there's some rocks at the bottom of the Grand Canyon where you can actually use 3 methods for dating the age of the rocks. And again, this was Andrew Snelling published this data. And so the 3 methods he could use, it was uranium, lead, rubidium, strontium, and samarium, neodymium. And so you got 3 different methods to date this rock. And so you read the dates. The uranium lead, it came out with 1.88 billion years old, plus or minus 53 million years. The samarium, neodymium came out 1.655 billion years, plus or minus 40 million years. And the rubidium strontium came out 1.24 billion years, plus or minus 84 million years. So if you're an 8th grader in earth science and you see this data, what are you going to conclude about the age of those rocks? And 8th grader, you're thinking more about lunch and PE than, I mean, you're sitting there. And so this data comes out, you say, wow, I got 3 different measurements saying that rock is over 1 billion years old. So obviously, that rock's got to be over 1 billion years old. But what's interesting, they missed the entire point of the data, because scientifically, the significance of that is not that they're all over 1 billion years old, but the point is that the error bars don't overlap. And that's much more significant scientifically. So I use my pen again. Say I sent this off to that first lab. It said it was 200 feet long, but say it said it was 200 feet long plus or minus 2 feet. And I said, well, this is really important. I'm calibrating with this, so I'm going to send it to another lab. Well, that second lab says it's 300 feet long plus or minus 3 feet. And I want one final measurement, just so I'm sure I'm using the right calibration. Send it off to the third lab. It says it's 400 feet long plus or minus 4 feet. Okay, so I know this pin's at least 200 feet long, right? No. What I know is at least 2 of those measurements is wrong, because it cannot simultaneously be 200 feet long plus or minus 2 feet, 300 feet long plus or minus 3 feet, and 400 feet long plus or minus 4 feet. The error bars are not overlapping. So I know at least two of the 3 measurements are wrong, and more likely all 3 are wrong, because why wouldn't you tend to get the same dates if it's the same general technique? And so that's the important part. When we see data like this, now it could be a significant clue that just purely scientifically we should pursue, because now I can start looking at, okay, what's the differences between uranium, samarium, rubidium? Why would, if the decay rates change, why would they change differently? Are there differences between whether it's an alpha emitter, whether it's a beta emitter, what the atomic number of all kinds of just really fertile scientific research that could be done in this area. But again, it would be, it wouldn't even be worth sending in a proposal on. It'd be so shunned, just because of just the basic premise that, hey, maybe there were significant changes in these dates in the past. So a lot of people are, again, we've said that the age issue is not relevant. Evolution doesn't work no matter how old the universe is. But again, gave the Fred Hoyle assumption. I used his amoeba. I just ran some numbers. Again, it doesn't matter if the Earth is a second old, 1 billion years old, 1 billion years old. It doesn't change the numbers. And so again, it's impossible no matter what. But again, it comes down to if we tell people it's okay to distort the Bible to accommodate age, or we can compromise on what the Bible says because of age, then really why don't we compromise in every other way? Why don't we compromise issues related to worship? If someone's uncomfortable with worship, well, we'll just compromise. We'll just do something differently to make them happier with our worship. Roles in the church, plan of salvation. Just compromise with whatever makes people not have to think. But again, that might seem good to us. It might be something that we think, well, at least I could get this person into the building. But Proverbs 14:12 tells us there is a way which seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. So just want to conclude. We all choose where we put our faith. Atheistic theories and dating methods that contradict the Bible are extremely weak and highly dependent on assumptions. I wish we had time to go into more detail on things like the Big Bang. And just if you get into the details, it's almost and I have to be careful how I phrase this, it's almost embarrassing to think someone could be challenged by those, or would feel like somehow they have to incorporate the Big Bang into the Bible, they have to incorporate these long ages into the Bible because they're so weak, they're so full of assumptions. But it's also, to people that struggle with this, to their credit, it's what they've been told their whole life. And so it's very important, because again, it's a way that people are led astray from the Bible. But it's also, if we can get someone to really think about where they're putting their faith, to really think about it, they should eventually come to the conclusion. I grew up outside the church. It took me at least 10 years from when I started doubting evolution until I became a Christian. And probably closer to, about 10, maybe 12. And so again, it's not something overnight. It's something that we plant the seed and then hope people just really start thinking about it. Joshua 24:15, if it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves today whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served, which were beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So thank you very much for your attention. And again, look forward to the rest of the discussion and hopefully the question and answer.
If these kinds of things are of interest to you, then we encourage you to go to our website at apologeticspress.org and look at the offerings that we have there available for free. We have other products that are available for purchase that we print or that we produce and sell, DVDs and books and several other offerings there. If you have any specific questions that you might have for me or any of the people at Apologetics Press that that might be relevant to, we encourage you to email us at mail@apologeticspress.org. Thank you very much for your attention.